Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here tonight. I'm Sarah Russell. I'm a PGY5 on the research track at UNC, and I am the chair elect for the section of residents and fellows at the Academy. Really lovely to have everyone with us tonight. We're following up on a panel that we were going to have at Academy that was unfortunately interrupted by the fire alarm, but all the better reason to gather again and chat about early career transitions. So I'm just going to quickly take some time to introduce our panelists starting out with Dr. Farzal. So Dr. Zainab Farzal is a head and neck surgical oncologist and microvascular reconstructive surgeon and a new assistant professor at the UT Southwestern Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. She completed the 7-year surgeon scientist residency track at UNC with me and completed her head and neck fellowship at UCSF recently. And during her time at UNC, Dr. Farzal completed an NIH 232 research training postdoctoral fellowship, and she also obtained her MPH or her Master's in Public Health from the UNC Gilling School of Global Public Health with a focus in public health leadership. Her research interests are broad, include health services research addressing sex and race-related health disparities and access to care issues within otolaryngology. And she's providing plenty of expertise, but in particular, she has unique expertise as one of our recent graduates pursuing an academic practice. So thank you, Dr. Farzal. Excited to have you. Next, we have Dr. Stacy Ishman. So she became a full professor in otolaryngology, head and neck surgery at the University of Cincinnati in 2016, and she currently works as an instructor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and faculty at Dayton Children's Hospital and the Peyton Manning Children's Hospital. She is the Market Chief Medical Officer for AmeriHealth, and she is the past president of the International Surgical Sleep Society. Dr. Ishman earned her medical degree from Rush Medical College and completed her residency at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She then completed fellowship in pediatric otolaryngology at Johns Hopkins and underwent advanced sleep training as a member of faculty from 2005 to 2013. Appreciate her input today, particularly as a seasoned attending with multiple administrative positions in service within the Academy. Then we have Dr. David Mellon. So Dr. Mellon has served as the president and CEO of Carolina ENT Sinus and Allergy Center since 2017. He earned his undergraduate degree in cognitive science from University of Virginia, and he completed his medical education at the Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson Medical School. He then pursued residency at the Ohio State Medical Center. Dr. Mellon is an active member of the Academy, the American Thyroid Association, a fellow of the American College of Surgeons, and a fellow of the Triological Society. Most recently, he was elected as chairman of the inaugural otolaryngology private practice section. We appreciate his input today as a private practice otolaryngologist with many years of leadership within the Academy. And then last but not least, we have Dr. Doug Backus. So Dr. Backus is a board certified neurologist who practices in Washington State. He graduated the University of Washington School of Medicine, did internship and residency at Baylor College of Medicine, and went on to complete a research followed by clinical fellowships in neurology at Johns Hopkins University, and he then stayed on as faculty thereafter. He and his family moved back to Seattle, where he was an employed physician for several years before joining ENT and Allergy Associates, an independent private practice. He is the outgoing president of Academy's board of directors this year, and we appreciate Dr. Bax's perspective as a prior academic surgeon who transitioned into private practice. So thank you again to everyone for being here. So I know that I just took some time to introduce them in this particular light, but I would be more than happy to have the panelists one by one say anything else they'd be like to add and tell us what their first major career transition was. And we can start with Dr. Farzal.
Thank you, Dr. Russell, for working on this panel and the rest of SRF. Can you guys hear me okay? I am on an island, so I apologize for the poor lighting. I'm doing what I can with a little light on the side here. But my first career transition was essentially, obviously, there was the transition from residency to fellowship, but then even bigger than that, fellowship to being an attending. I think everybody tells you it's going to be different, and it doesn't actually hit you until you get there. But obviously, the buck stops with you. You are the ultimate decision maker for everything and the ultimate responsible party. And so, that obviously getting used to that role takes a little bit of time, no matter how independent your fellowship was. So, that has been something that comes with its growing pains. There's, little nuances in there about billing that I wish I was a little bit more familiar with. And yeah, I mean, essentially, you throughout your career as a resident or as a fellow, you've been trying to figure out how much autonomy you're going to give trainees, working on that. You find yourself in a role of being an educator, a researcher, a mentor. And it's really putting all of that together while you're building your clinical practice. So I think that transition has been, I would say overall pretty pleasant. But as we kind of go through the panel, I'd love to talk about, things that I wish I had known beforehand or things I would do differently.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And you can feel free to popcorn it, but I'll pass the speaking baton, so to speak, to Dr. Ishman.
So, I started my career in academic medicine mostly because I didn't think if I started in private practice, I would ever try academic medicine. So I thought it was the best way to try it. And it worked out. I stayed there for like 20 years and then, have subsequently gone on to try some other things. But I don't know that mine was as well thought out as Dr. Farzal's. I just thought it was like a good place to start.
Perfect. Thanks. Dr. Mellon.
I'm not on an island, but I'm in North Carolina, and my signal keeps coming in and out because we're bracing for our first snow here in 3 years, at least in our part of the state. So I think my internet's misbehaving ahead of time.
Also in North Carolina, so we might both have the
So
same issue.
the madness that 3 inches of snow can bring is crippling. So my one and only transition into practice was out of residency and into private practice. And but I would say that the practice has been dynamic. It's changed in multiple 13 years. So the practice has changed. And so I feel like even though I've not switched jobs, my role within the practice becoming more of the managing partner has changed. So I've remained in one place for the last 13 years, but we'll get into it how my role within the practice has changed. So I felt like I've existed in a couple of different practices, although I've been in the same place, and it's a constant state of transition.
Dr. Backus. Thank you so much, Dr. Mellon.
So I would say my first transition was from residency at Baylor in Texas, having come from Seattle, Washington, and then going to Baltimore, Maryland to become a fellow in a totally different environment. And it was quite interesting, quite challenging, because even just going into fellowship, your role changes. You start as a residency graduate, and you graduate as an attending. And I think Stacy touched on it a bit. That just doesn't happen overnight. I mean, there's a lot of maturation in that, and I think that's where some of the fellowships. So currently in my private practice, I'm part of a consortium of 35 practices under an umbrella we call Pro Alliance Surgeons. So we have 144 orthopedic surgeons. So thank God you're an otolaryngologist. That's all I'll say. And good people, but different motivations. And I have a fellowship within the private practice where my otology fellows, they do on the average, about 420 cases a year when the year that they're here. But part of that is a maturation for them where they're taking call in the ER on their own. They spend time with our CEO. They spend time with our practice manager. They go over the books with us every month. We teach them where revenue is generated. They have their own independent clinic day, and we follow their numbers. And so it's really eye-opening when it hits usually about December when they start in July, where the fellows all of a sudden realize that their time is valuable. And they understand, as Dr. Farzal said, this whole coding and billing thing is something I revisit every year. And every year I find out I'm billing about 60% of what I'm supposed to. And it's real numbers. And I think this, guilt about billing for your services has got to go away, because the last time I checked, my lawyer bills pretty consistently for their services. So I think that the transition is a maturation into being on your own. I think the challenge with residents, in the last 5 years versus the residents prior, even since COVID, is the case numbers are lower when you're a resident. And our fellows come and they think, I mean, they're board eligible, board certified otolaryngologists, and it's just like they just are blown away by how much more there is to know. And I just don't think you can cram all that into a residency. So I think and then my first big transition was from, my fellowship and then going to Virginia Mason in Seattle, where I started and spent my first 13 years of career, and building my own program, getting my own donors, all that kind of stuff was very, very interesting. So But the challenges I think are very common. They're much more common between academics and private practice than you think. The academic model has changed. You now have to actually pay for yourself, and you can't do it anymore 1 day a week. You're getting the same rates as everybody else in the community, and all of a sudden the university doesn't have money to throw around and buy off your time. So I think there's a lot more in common.
Perfect. I think that's a great setup to talk about your kind of first job search and that sort of thing. So, how did y'all navigate your first job search? And this could be including a fellowship if you decided to pursue fellowship, or straight out of residency or after your fellowship.
I'm off mute, so I'll jump in. So I actually couldn't quite figure out what fellowship I was going to do. I was going to be a neurotologist, and I did all those interviews, and then I did my peds rotation and realized I cared probably more about ears than being on the other side. Like I was more concerned, I didn't care about the dura. Let's just say that. And I really liked the kids, so I was told at the last second, and I'll tell you that the match was done, 1 week away from happening, that I went on one interview for peds at one place that if I wanted to, I might be able to match. And I did match there. I also had to tell the chair at the time, it was at Johns Hopkins. And the only question he asked me was, why don't you want to be a neurotologist? Because he was a neurotologist. So I had to explain that. But I ended up matching there, and it was actually a hard decision to decide because I thought at the time I could have been perfectly happy, and I think today I could have been perfectly happy going either direction. Like the beautiful thing about ENT is that we have so many great colleagues doing so many great things. The reason so many of us go into private practice or have general comprehensive practices is because we like the breadth of otolaryngology. And so I picked what was really a general ENT position for children and really have enjoyed that. And so, like I said, I picked academics just because I thought that was a good place. But my first, time interviewing, I was told, look at everything. Meet with private practices, meet with hospital employed, meet with academic jobs. And I did all that. And it was really useful, one, to see my own value. I think that comment we heard earlier about not understanding your own value is really hard. And I coach now and I work with a lot of young physicians. And that's one of the biggest changes is how do you figure out how you go from being somebody who's used to knowing what everybody else in the room likes to knowing what you like and that you have worth and that you should be asking and taking care of the things that you should be taking care of. So I think that transition was important and that looking at all those different opportunities was important. And I think they're even more solid these days than it used to be. That I think private practice has had a beautiful resurgence. I think it was kind of a dip and now people are realizing it's a great, area to be in. And then I also think hospital employed is really different than it used to be. I mean, there's venture capital, there's, hospital systems, there's all kinds of different options with all the pros and cons. So, I'm not trying to make a comment, but I just think there's way more options now than it felt like when I started, where you were like, you were private or you're academic. Should I be handing it off, Dr. Farzal?
So I can jump in just a little bit. I think I can tell you that my first job was in pursuit of what my mentors at Johns Hopkins wanted me to do, and I think that's very important. I've counseled very interestingly or mentored people through med school into residency, and then what they did after residency and after fellowship. Some people have done very prestigious fellowships and gone into private practice, and some people have gone into private practice and gone back and done fellowships. And I think the challenge is, and this is just right out of, the Mel Robbins, let them concept of, I was pursuing, Charlie Cummings was like a role model to me. And he was my chairman at University of Washington. He was my chairman at Johns Hopkins. And I didn't want to let Charlie down. And so I had to do something that was academic, producing papers. And because of the respect I had for the people that I felt allowed me to become an otolaryngologist, I don't regret my decisions, but I'm extremely happy as a private practitioner. I've been hospital employed and I've been academic as well. And each of them have their value. Each of them have their risks. I mean, when you're in your hospital employed position and your academic position, you're not meeting until 9 o'clock at night with your partners talking about who's going to sign on the lease. You can have anything you want in private practice, any piece of equipment. All you have to do is buy it. And so there's an immediate value assigned to it. And so, something that I've really come to grips with is people can say whatever they want about me. They don't fund my 401k. They don't pay for my kids' college, and they don't care whether I stay married or not. And everybody can have their own dream for me, but the only dream that really matters is my dream. And I can tell you that it only took me 24 years to get to that point in my career. So it's always an ongoing discussion. And I think one of the challenges with residency programs today is there's very little exposure to private practice rotations. So I always tell the tale of two Webbers. I was at Baylor in the heyday, and we had Randy Weber over at MD Anderson, who was the chair of head and neck cancer with, actually at that point, he was the vice chair behind Helmuth Gepfert. And we had Sam Weber, his brother, who was the busiest private practitioner in Houston. And we rotated with both Webers. And both Webers contributed significantly to my resident education. I can tell you I did a fourth of my cases over 2 years of my residency with Sam Weber. That's how busy his group was. And Randy Weber and Helmuth Gepfert took me to places in the skull base that I never imagined a human could wander. And so there was this incredible gift from both sides and very good role models in academics. I wrote my trilogic thesis with Randy Weber as my mentor. And for years, I called Sam Weber for advice on how to do a case. Nowadays, because of workforce issues, hour issues, that limitations on residency, you don't get the opportunity to rotate in the private sector as much. And as Stacy said, I think the opportunity for that is becoming apparent now. And I think residency programs should really start doing that. And Charlie Cummings had a rule: you were not allowed to look down on anybody, whether they're in academics or private practice. And Bobby Alford had the same rule. And we're all good otolaryngologists. And some of those people in private practice are doing 2 or 3 times the volume of the entire department you're in. And you can't deny that. And so there's a lot of potential for mentoring, for education, and for quality of life decision making with people in different practice models. And to think that all private practitioners are happy is a fantasy. To think that all academics are happy is a fantasy. And some of that, as Stacy through her coaching probably can address, is how you're addressing whose dream you're chasing and how happy you are with that. So I think part of it is just finding out what you really want to do.
Yeah, I would agree. Sorry, Dr. Farzal. I would agree with that as well. I mean, the whole "to thy own self be true," right? I mean, you've got to really sort of know who you are. I think at the end of the day, being an otolaryngologist is fantastic. It'll probably make it in my obituary, but it's not going to be probably number 1, 2 on the list. And so you really have to sort of have, what is it that matters most to you? And if it's the sort of the pursuit of something that is very unique within the field, then maybe otolaryngology is your number 1. But obviously there's family, there's elements of community and the setting that you'd like to practice in, where in the country. So you really got to sort of, I think, know all of those things. Ultimately, I really feel like for most individuals, your practice can morph into what is going to ultimately bring you joy. And I've found that my practice has changed again in dynamics. Stacey, I think you indicated yours has taken a very sort of interesting path as well. So really, what are your non-negotiables? Like, what are you absolutely not going to negotiate on for your own self, and lead with those things first.
Yeah, I can't agree with that enough. I'd say the same thing. I think knowing your non-negotiables is incredibly important. Having your priorities straight is important. You might want to be the next leader in ENT, but knowing where that falls with your other priorities and the other things you're juggling is important. For me, when I was looking for my first job, actually the location was the most important thing. I wanted it to be academic, and it worked out that the perfect academic job was open near home, but like being close to my family and my parents getting older, that was the most important thing. So yeah, I think you definitely have to sort of think about those things ahead of time and just be honest with yourself. You won't be happy if your your top priorities aren't being met by the jobs you're finding or seeking out.
I would also say people get so worried that their first job has to be the right job. I think Doug and I are clear examples that you could just try something else.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was incredibly enlightening. And y'all mentioned a lot of different priorities that you considered when you were looking for your first job or kind of thinking about those, where you wanted to go, at least in this initial aspect of your career. How did those different aspects of your non-negotiables play into your first contract negotiation, and how did y'all navigate that?
Well, I had a 5-month-old. So my husband at the time said, "Can we please not move?" Which seemed very reasonable. And so my contract negotiation came down to, how do I not move? And so I stayed at Johns Hopkins because that's where I was a fellow. And Lloyd Minor told me it was good for me, and so did Charlie Cummings. So, I believe them. And it was good for me. But, that doesn't mean it was the only thing that would have been good for me at the time. But I think just like we heard from Dr. Farzal, location became important because not moving became the most important thing. And then also trying to figure out, what I wanted to do with my time. So in academics, we talk a lot about, having time for research or having time for administrative time, but that could be just as important. I work now at a hospital employed practice, and there are people in the practice who are 0.6 and 0.5, and not because they're trying to do a research project, but because they have other priorities in life. And so I think those things are important to understand too.
Yeah. Regarding the contract negotiation, the one thing I would add to that too is, for me, I mean, I was burned out, like 7 years of training and then 1 more year of fellowship. I needed more time, so I negotiated a later start date. I really pushed it by another month to like 3 months instead of 2. But remember that that's, if you have the negotiating power, that's something you can ask for, particularly if you have just had a child, or for me, I had just gotten married, just moved back. We were trying to figure out our life, so that was incredibly helpful. On the research side of things, asking for a startup funding was important for me. And that was something I kind of went back and forth with the chair, and, trying to find different mechanisms, which I think is important if you're going to be in an academic setting. They always have more money than advertised. And you just have to, you have to make your case. And I think that's important.
It's interesting when I negotiated in, so I did a 6-year Baylor residency and a 2-year neurology fellowship when they were only 1 year. So some of us take a little bit longer to figure things out. But I actually negotiated an immediate start. So I started my job 4 days after I finished my fellowship and negotiated a break 3 months in, because I didn't have if I would have taken a month off, I would have been selling pencils trying to raise enough money to pay my rent. And so I got enough of a startup, got some money generated. Then I took a couple weeks off or 3 weeks off with my family as everybody was adapting. So, the only thing you're not going to get in a negotiation is the thing you don't ask for, or at least not have it considered. And so I think really sitting down and saying, what's really important. I would tell you that, like I said, I've been in multiple different practice environments. Really high-end microscopes are the same no matter which one you're in. Endoscopes are the same no matter what you're in. People are so focused on negotiating for their equipment that they forget that what probably means a lot more is, what are the variables to keep you and whatever your current family situation is, right? So if you're single and you want to meet somebody, you may not want to do a single solo private practice job in a town of 3,000. You may not want to live in a downtown high rise if you've got a couple kids. I mean, it depends on what you're used to, right? And I was always told that you're only as happy in your job as your spouse is happy. And my wife actually threw that back at me, and she said, "If you're miserable, we're all miserable." So, and I guess we actually got to the point of working with a marriage counselor to understand what was important to both of us before we made that negotiation for a job. And what that allowed us to do is really have a third person answer in and help us come up with a list. Like, this is what you guys said was important. Is it important? And it allowed a really mature conversation, because I think, at least in my experience, I can't speak for everyone here, I still cannot believe they let me into an ENT residency.
Mhm.
And I considered every step of it as people letting me do it. And it was a gift, which I still believe that. But that doesn't mean that I don't have a role in choosing my path in that career. And so, that was a very important thing for me to understand, and, stop feeling as though every day is Halloween or Christmas. But, when the money hits the road and it's the middle of June, be happy where you are, because that's a pretty boring time of life otherwise. So
I would say that at least my own experience with my private practice and looking at the contract, that there was probably not a lot of latitude with as sort of signing in agreement, and then in a partnership agreement, probably not a lot of latitude to negotiate for things. Those things are pretty much set in stone. But it was the group and the dynamic. Was there enough flexibility to allow me to sort of be my own boss? Because that was what ultimately drew me to private practice to begin with. And so I think there was probably less wiggle room on the contract, but it was ultimately dynamic that allowed me the freedom to practice in a way that I want. And I think that was more of the spirit of has been the spirit of the group than anything that was sort of within the contract.
Related to that, is there anyone that y'all had help you go through your contracts, like a mentor or a lawyer, marriage counselor? Anyone else that we haven't listed so far?
I had my practice administrator from when I was a resident look at everything, or from when I was a fellow look at the one for my next job, because they knew the business of medicine way better than I did. And then I had some of my academic mentors look at it, but quite honestly, I don't think they knew as much about money, the money side of it, and if they weren't far enough up in the administration. And then I will also say, and I should have said before probably, but it is really important that you negotiate, and men are much better at doing this than women. Women will do things like make sure they get vacation time or advocate for others, but like there is wiggle room on the salary. Like you should ask for more money. And the other thing, I love Doug's point. So I negotiated to be paid as a fellow for the first month, like for July, so that I had health insurance. And they just paid for an extra month at my fellow salary just so I had health insurance instead of taking a month off. So I thought it was a really good point. But yeah, I think there's really smart people to look at it, and a lawyer is the other person you should absolutely have a look at it.
it's very fascinating, and having a lawyer look at a contract doesn't start with your first contract; it's every contract. I have never signed a non-compete. Every organization I've gone to has told me that I have to sign a non-compete, and I say, well, then we're not good together. Amazingly, all of those non-competes were thrown out of my contract. So I think, again, if you don't ask, you don't know. But lawyers look at your contract not as what you're getting for your contract. They're thinking about how are you going to get out of this if you want to do it. And what we think of as a correlative conjunction means something entirely different to a lawyer and changes the entire focus of the paragraph of a contract. And so, I would say don't sign any contract without spend the money. I mean, $2,000, whatever it is up front to review your contract beats the heck out of $250,000 down the road trying to get out of it. My partner down here is Greg Davis, a well-known rhinologist. He spent 3 years trying to get out of his non-compete at the University of Washington and finally gave up and worked around it. The institutions are bullies with this. So, and the other thing is it's hard for us as physicians because we start with our heart and engage our brain, right? What people in business think is common practice is offending to us. It's offensive. But people want to make money. And they're assuming that you're representing yourself well in the negotiation, and they're not going to look after you. And the best negotiators convince you they are. So smile, thank them, and then have your attorney review it and come back and make what demands are reasonable. And as David's saying, a lot of these things there's not a ton of wiggle room. In private practice, you're typically joining an organization that the people that are sitting there offering you the job have done the blood, sweat, and leases to get the practice there. They've bought everything. Buy-ins are there for a reason because everybody has spent years and years building these things out. But the other side of that is your buy-in shouldn't be obtrusive that you can't pay your student loans and buy a house at the same time. So there's some reality that's having to come to that whole equation as well. But, I've actually had, my wife and I have a strong Christian belief. We've had our pastors review our contracts and say, wait a minute, what's this going to do to your family? and they ask these really hard questions that, are you really going to ask that again? But they're very important because, again, the pastor's looking at longevity. Lawyers are looking at the end game if you want to get out of a contract. We're just so dang happy to have a job and not be called a resident or a fellow. We'll sign anything. So it's got to meet somewhere in the middle.
Perfect. So something that's come up a lot as a theme across all of our panelists is talking about, priorities, including our job, but really that work-life balance. So particularly early on, but also throughout your careers, how did you navigate that work-life balance, but particularly early in your career as you're trying to get your practice off the ground?
I can start on that one. I think, one of the things for me, particularly for my research time, which is predominantly health services, public health type research, I've tried to do some of it from home as much as possible to be around. Um, the other part of it too is we try to, like, between my husband and my husband's also a surgeon. We try to not have too many calls at the same time. There's been instances, well, it happened once where I had a case that went until about midnight. And he came and picked me up from the hospital, like made me leave my car there, which was very sweet. But I think it's just like having that support system early on, wherever you have flexibility in your schedule, whether it's like your admin time, where you can work from home, or you can be available in a way. I think that's helped a lot.
Well, I can say I had none when I started. Hopefully, everybody else has better answers, but I had like a 5-month-old, and was Q2, and I was starting a new practice, and I was getting my master's, and I don't even know how I did it actually right now that I just said that. So I have no idea. I don't even remember those couple years. I tried to pay as much attention and time with my baby at the time. And I don't know, the rest kind of fell into place, but like I was really just trying to get through it. So to me, it was probably more of a continuation of residency and fellowship, which I don't recommend to anybody else. So I very much appreciate now having a much better balance than I did then, but it's because I understand to make it a priority then, and I did not understand probably well enough how to do it back then.
I would say I never got it right, but I never stopped trying. And I think there's every action starts with a thought. And I thought a lot and didn't execute a lot. So actions don't happen if you don't execute on what you're thinking about. And I was I basically, my career has been very selfish to me at the expense to my family a lot. And trying to explain to a 3-year-old when I was a resident why I was leaving his birthday party to go take care of a facial fracture of a guy who was too drunk not to hit the telephone pole at Ben Taub was a hard conversation. I didn't get to see him blow his candles out. It's like, and he didn't go to bed. He waited for me to come home so he could share with me the joy of his birthday I missed. That's a hard thing. So fundamentally, what we do is fairly selfish to our families as a surgeon. And some of that's a social contract we can't control. But I had one of my kids really struggled for a while in college. And I said, I think there's a difference between being there and being present while you're there. And I could not be present. I was in the middle of my graduate degree in business at the School of Business at University of Washington, and I didn't drop out of the program, but I scaled back. And I was working through some of the committees and leadership structure of the ANS. I dropped out of it. I just let it all go. I stopped going to meetings because I needed to be physically in Seattle when my son called. And I don't regret it. But during that time, I was given the opportunity to rethink every trip I ever made, every time I left my family standing to go be important at a meeting, and it didn't feel good. And it's one thing to stop there. It's another thing to say, okay, what am I going to do differently moving forward? And a good example would be, I didn't become president of the academy till all my kids were out of the house, and I actually had time to do it. And margin is not my middle name. Okay, ADD is more accurate. So I think it really shifted my thought process to everything doesn't have to happen in a day. And I like to make my contributions to the field. But when we die, maybe we'll get a editorial in the Odo Bulletin. But what's really important is what your kids say about you in your really in your eulogy, right? And I read a great book and it said, we're basically writing what people are going to say about us at our funeral. What do you want them to say about you? And boy, I'll tell you, it really starts making work-life balance much more important.
I don't want to take anybody else's time, but I'll tell you, my oldest son used to tell people I leave my children to take care of other people's children, and he was not
Yeah.
wrong.
Wow.
Yeah, it like just hurts you, right? And as I've gotten older, he wrote his college essay a couple of years ago, and what he said was, "My mom used to be a doctor," which was a fantastic thing. By the way, I didn't stop being a doctor, but what I stopped doing was leaving my kids all the time on times that I thought were really important. And so the fact that he said she used to be a doctor, I think meant I used to prioritize my medical career over my family. And so I was kind of proud that he wrote, "I used to be a doctor."
I guess one of the things I'll throw in is, particularly going back, when my kids were young, I stopped accepting honorariums when I spoke and asked for extra plane tickets. And I would always and I started taking one kid at a time on a trip. And all the agenda, I mean, I don't need to sit in bars in Japan eating sushi and talking about whatever. I'd rather have my kid in Tokyo so he can experience Japan. And so I did that with my son when he was 10. So each of my kids have been in different parts of the world. And I took the whole family to Hong Kong for a cochlear implant meeting. And when it came down to being the president, I actually talked to my family before I put my name in, and they're all out of the house. And they said, Dad, this really isn't your deal. This is our deal. We've been in this together as a family through your entire medical career, and we're going to enjoy this. So when I finished in Miami this year, my entire family came. My husband, my son's wife came, and we called it the Bacchus ENT Rager. We just had a blast. We rented a catamaran. We enjoyed the academy meeting, enjoyed the social functions. My kids came to the opening ceremony, and man, I looked at my wife and I lost it. I mean, I got choked up because it was something that we did together. And I think that was a big shift that happened when my first kid was about 8 years old. And I said, wait a minute, if I can't make this about my family, I'm just not going to do it that way.
I think it's important to recognize, Doug, that's amazing information. That's so awesome that you're able to weave your personal and your professional together. So they can coexist. It's important to recognize I was under this misconception that there was an end to the amount of work that exists, that you could like
Pardon my laugh.
everybody laughed now. It was the sense that if I could just get caught up, if I could just get caught up, right? If I could just get to this point, there is no end to the amount of work ever. And so I think the sooner you realize that, the sooner it helps you to pace things, where there is no such thing as ever getting caught up. It will always be there. It will always be waiting for you. So don't chase after trying to complete work, because you never will.
I think that's an excellent way to close out that question. I'm going to pivot a little bit. So, when you were starting out and earlier on in your career, how did y'all go about establishing and defining your personal brand? And how did you work on, I guess, like tailoring it and communicating that brand?
So I
You want to
think,
go back reverse order? Because I feel like Doug and I have talked a lot.
I was about to start calling people out, but then conveniently people unmuted. All right, Dr. Farzal, you first.
So it very much depends on how you define your brand, right? Like what do you sort of consider that? Because it can be, like, as I was saying before, it can be that you're an educator, it can be that you're a mentor, it can be that you're a leader, it can be a combination of those things. And so I think it's really an amalgamation of the things you bring to the table. And for me, as someone starting out in my career, I would say, I was fortunate enough to have a little bit of time and training to try and develop that brand, but it's still something I'm working on. But it involves, being an educator and a researcher as well as a cancer surgeon. And it's been something that have been, working on and will continue to work on. But I think, those roles that you play for yourself and also for other people, like mentorship or leadership, go into your brand as well. I think, I remember talking to one of my prior mentors who was like, you don't really think about personality traits going into your brand, but some of those can be part of your brand too, like kindness. That can be something that stands out about you, and that's kind of how they defined part of my brand. And I was like, oh, didn't think of it that way. But a lot of it has to do with then like how people approach you or how comfortable trainees are with you, and like what kind of environment you create for them. So I think really a lot of things come together on your personal brand, and it's something I'm still working on, but something that's starting to take shape.
I think for me, it was as I was growing in private practice, was just focusing on connecting with the obvious referring, physicians in the community. And so my brand quickly became and has remained the accessibility piece, to be known as someone who was always accessible, that could see anybody and would see anybody. And that's actually one of the reasons I went into private practice, is because I felt like a lot of the barriers that maybe existed in other practice dynamics just weren't there. It was as simple as, you will call me and I will guarantee you whatever you need, I will see that patient that day for you. And so that was something that was so critical to me, that I thought was really a cornerstone of the kind of accessibility, has been a part of my brand and remains that way. So really in private practice, but in any practice dynamic, getting out, showing your face, getting people to know who you are in the medical community is absolutely critical.
Now, I'm sure as a coach, Stacy can touch on this, but I think before I could generate my brand, I needed to understand what my personal mission statement was. And it took a long time. And, my personal mission statement is to use the talents God's given me and the gifts He's given me to improve the quality of life for as many people as possible that I never meet. And I think when you treat a patient, you treat their family. You may not meet grandma, grandpa, but when you take the tumor out of somebody and they don't die, you've impacted a family, who's impacted a village, who's impacted a neighborhood. And so a lot of people spend a lot of time generating a commercial brand. And I will say that the most successful physicians in my education and my mentors knew who they were, and their brand stemmed from the fact that they had a very high level of integrity, and they could talk to you even about the tough things. And so I think, David touched on the three A's. You've got a great ability, you're available, and you are affable. When I call my referral docs, I know who wants to be texted, I know who wants to be phone called, I know who wants an email, and I know who wants a letter. That's how close. And I write notes about my referral docs. Kid went to Stanford, so next time I talk to him, how's your daughter at Stanford? You remembered? Yeah, I wrote it down. It's important. That's how you build a relationship. And so there's a lot of people who tell you they can build a brand. They can build you a website, they can build you a logo, they can build you a tagline, but you are your brand. And I think understanding yourself allows you to infect people around you to want to use your services and include you in the care and lives of their patients.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think at the beginning of your career, sometimes it's a little hard to figure that personal vision statement. I think you know some of it. I think some of it evolves over time. I will tell you, if you're looking just on the academic side, I really think figuring out what you want to be known for and having one academic area is really important so that people know who you are. And I can tell you, I started by writing something about medical education and something about sleep apnea and something about, some other sinusitis thing. And then nobody had any idea what my brand was. They just knew I was somebody who wrote 3 papers that had nothing to do with each other. So if you're looking for an academic brand, picking an area and then making sure you pick one word. This is what I coach people on, is like, so mine's obstructive sleep apnea. And if within my first 2 years, somebody said, look, Stacy, make sure the word that you care about is in everything that you do. So for me, it was sleep, and every talk was about sleep and every presentation was about sleep because it was something I was passionate about. It was something I cared about. I walked in the door knowing that I wanted to make the lives of kids with sleep apnea better. But it also meant it made it really easy for me to say yes or no to a project. And I had a friend who was in the allergy field. And she said, I want to do something together. So we looked at allergic rhinitis in kids who snore. We could find ways to work together. If we want to work with Doug, we could look at language acquisition in kids with and without snoring who have cochlear implants. We can mesh our interests together all kinds of places, but knowing where you want to be known in an academic side is really about making sure you're consistent in that. And I don't know, it's so much a brand. It's not who I am, but it is what I want to be known for. And I think on the academic side, doing that early really helps you to be known and for people to figure out when to put you on the program and ask you to write a paper and send you a patient, even more importantly.
As you're starting to, kind of develop that brand, starting to get your, your feet wet, I suppose, in your earlier years of practice, obviously you're also simultaneously navigating a lot of imposter syndrome. And so how did y'all navigate that? And what tips do you have to people who are earlier in their career, particularly like early attendings who are starting to try to navigate that imposter syndrome?
I'd say I think there is some level of like nervousness or uncertainty that comes with being in an entirely new role, doing things completely on your own that you have done like many times before, but it's different now. And I think that is very normal. I think that's outside the realm of imposter syndrome. I think that's just what everybody experiences, whether they talk about it or not. Obviously, imposter syndrome, it pertains more so to actually like beginning to believe that you don't have the capability to do the things that you actually do. And I think, ultimately the things you have to fall back on are, and I would say probably two things. Like one is your fund of knowledge, and two is your clinical training, and the thing to remember is if both of those things are solid, then you're good. You just have to keep reminding yourself of that. Affirmations, checking in with mentors. Those are things that I've found to be really helpful. Some other advice I got, when you're first starting out, from some mentors was that try not to take on the most difficult of everything right when you start. Everybody has complications. That is the reality of it. You want to save those for a little bit later. So when they happen, they don't completely beat you up. And your end of complications isn't like one of one, of cases you've done. And that's something I remembered particularly for free flap surgery. I made sure that my first free flap was a little radial forearm for a partial glossectomy and not a crazy, serratus rib lat thing that I did, which I probably will not do for a very long time. But and then sometimes I don't know. I am very like based on a county hospital 80% of my time, and so I did find myself doing a lot more salvage versions of ablations before I actually did like straightforward versions of them, which was inevitable in its own way. But I think generally, if you can avoid doing kind of the harder iteration of things when you're first starting out, I think that will make you, you'll get a lot of good cases under your belt. You'll build your confidence, and it'll prepare you for when you have those first complications.
Yeah, I would say I think we have this misconception that everybody that we've ever worked with knew everything they were doing when they were doing these cases or seeing these patients.
100%. Yeah.
Like I used to walk out of the room and Google stuff. I sometimes do it in the room right now. So I don't know stuff all the time. And I tell people, I know I don't know stuff. I'm better about telling you I don't know stuff right now. I'll be like, hey, I have a colleague across the hall who does this more often than I do. I'm going to go, get his opinion on this and I'll be right back. Or I'm going to have to talk to an expert down the road, or I'm going to have to call the OD person. Like I actually think part of it is living in the discomfort of not knowing that we just get better at. It's not that I'm less of an imposter. It's that I am more comfortable not knowing what I'm doing and being able to tell people that. My wife tells everybody she wishes she had the confidence of a mediocre ENT surgeon. And I'm pretty sure I'm the mediocre ENT surgeon that she's talking about when she says that. So I think she's just trying to say, we all walk around acting like we're really, really confident, but we know that there's things we don't know. And so I was talking to one of the people I coached today, and she's talked about knowing that the cases are really interesting when you feel a little uncomfortable and nervous about doing them. And I think you don't want your whole life to be that, but you want a little bit to be that, and to know that you still get nervous, like after doing it for 25 years or 30 years. And so it's not really so much about getting over imposter syndrome. It's that being comfortable and that feeling of being uncomfortable and not knowing. I think that's an area of growth.
That's well put. I would say, I think there's can be the potential for starting out in private practice. At least my experience was a little bit the opposite, which is where you feel like you know everything. And you have to quickly realize that so much of the successes and how you were set up for success in residency was so much more than you, and it was everything that was built up around you and the system. And so, when I started in a smaller community, recognizing that the same infrastructure didn't exist was a real sort of eye-opening thing. So, well, it's kind of the opposite. I feel like I can do anything. I'm very confident. I know I can do everything, but should I be doing it? And I think that was an eye-opening thing. But I think, Stacey, I really liked your comments about sort of living with the discomfort and having that be a part of the journey, or the uncertainty is absolutely a part of it. And it's not just something that is at the beginning of your career. It should be a long part of your career. That's what keeps it interesting. If you feel like you've mastered everything, you will get bored very quickly. So I think that is a part of the journey for sure.
Yeah, I think it's part of learning humility. And I think anybody who is a cocky surgeon doesn't do enough surgery, because Mother Nature has a way of bringing us back to earth rather quickly. And I was getting ready to climb Mount Rainier, and my guide was a guy named Dave Zahn. He'd been up Everest like 16 times at that point, and he said, You're not paying me to get you up the mountain. You're paying me to get you back to base camp." Right. And he had such a respect for the element, such a respect for the mountain. And I took that back to my practice. And I said, this is why I'm stressed out in the operating room. I feel like I've got to do it perfect. Now, as a very senior neurotologist, I just know when to stop, and I know what I can and cannot do. And so I think it's about accepting personal limitation and accepting the reality and the humility of you're not supposed to know the most. And I call my friends around the country pretty frequently when I have an issue, and my fellows call me and text me from the operating room. At least once a month I get one. And we take care of patients as part of a village. And I think the sooner you realize that, your stress level goes down, your work-life balance improves, and your practice becomes more fun. And I think what Dave said is very important. I mean, if you got a sinus problem, I'm not looking in your nose. I mean, I'm a one-trick pony. I do the ear and skull base. But even that, some things I just don't do as well as other neurotologists, so I send it to them. And it just keeps balance.
All right, y'all. Well, I want to be mindful of time. You've shared a lot of wisdom already. But before we go, I wanted to close out with either anything that surprised you during your early parts of your practice, and any other closing thoughts you would like to add.
So I'll just say that in private practice, one of my concerns was that I didn't, I didn't want to just, and this is not supposed to be taken this way. I didn't want to just do right. I didn't want to just sort of, kind of do bread and butter ENT and not find those challenging things that are out there that really sort of bring excitement. It Your practice will change in so many different ways. Clinically, it has the potential to, even if you go nowhere else, your practice can change. In private practice, it can change clinically. I've worn a lot of different hats, taking on management roles. So and talk about it, but so much of my practice is the business of medicine. So there's just so much opportunity for things to be dynamic that I don't think that people should feel like, one, as Stacy and Doug mentioned, that your first stop is your only stop. But even if you end up going nowhere else, you end up with in one physical location your whole career. I can guarantee you your practice is going to transition no less than 4 or 5 times over your entire career. And it's about embracing that and enjoying it.
I don't know if surprise is the right word, but I don't know that I ever thought I was going to be the chief medical officer of an insurance company, a coach, a real estate investor, and a part-time ENT surgeon at a hospital-based practice who also does PRN work. That was never on the vision statement that I made when I started my career. So I think letting life take you where it's interesting and where it makes sense for your family. Quite honestly, part of the reason I'm the CMO of an insurance company is it allows me to do remote work and be around when I have a whole bunch of teenage boys who cannot tell you when they're going to need you, but just physical presence has become so much more important in this time frame because I catch the 15 minutes when they are going to connect with me. I can't schedule that time in this phase of their lives. And so I love that life can work for me and I can use my medical degree to do so many different things and still get the joy of getting to go to clinic and having a 2-year-old play peekaboo with me, which, nobody at the insurance company is doing these days. So I think it's nice you get to live in a whole bunch of different worlds and try things. And I don't know what my next act is going to be. I love coaching and I love some other things. And, who knows, I get to do more or less of them as I move on because my life changes and my family changes and medicine lets you do all that stuff.
Yeah, I think, I'm to the point in my career now where, I'm looking at what point will I actually retire? Will that be 3 years, 5 years, 7 years? And it's a journey that needs to be planned. So each level of this career, getting there, working, getting your name, getting a referral base, and then you're there. And then a lot of people, when they're there, can't get out of the I've got to keep building it mode. Enjoy where you are. And then retiring at a time, in my mind, it's important where I can still look at retirement not as my chance to die, but my chance to live the next phase of my life. And how is the joy that I brought from my practice set me up to do that? And moving on. And it's I've got friends retiring around me. I've got friends that are going to work, forever, and let them. It's their joy. It's what they do. So for me, I'm like Dave. I do not want to be remembered as a neurotologist. I want to be remembered as a guy that loved his wife and loved his kids and helped people who he never met. And so that's a pretty broad agenda. And that also means when I retire, I'm not done. I got to find something else to do to keep helping people I'll never meet, because that's a personal mission statement that's guiding everything I do, even my retirement. So I would say think about yourself and really respect what your mentors want you to be, but you don't have to be what your mentor wants you to be. And at the end of the day, if you're really good at it, they got to be proud of you. And if they're not, let them.
I think that's great advice. I don't have too much more to add. I think, not nearly as dynamic as Dr. Ishman, but for me, I think one of the things starting out has been being heavily involved in a county hospital system, but then also at a university hospital system. And sort of navigating it's hard enough to navigate one system. And there's two that are partners, but don't necessarily crosstalk, and the insurances are different. And trying to get a patient, 1 month the patient has insurance for one, but that disappears the next month, but they're eligible at the other hospital. And so it's trying to I'm amazed at how much cancer navigation I do along with the cancer nurse navigator. And I think it's just one of those things that I don't know, it definitely comes with the territory, I suppose. And it's been good learning. But it really just sort of opens your eyes to our healthcare system and to its various facets. And I think that's been very eye-opening for me. And I think that's something as trainees you maybe don't get enough of, but it's something to look out for in your future jobs too. There's different practice models as we've talked about, but even within, a single job, you might find yourself between two different types of systems, for better or for worse. I think it's been good learning for me, but they come with their own, little pains and things you have to figure out in different patient populations who are like all lovely to take care of, but require different things from you. And that takes time to build.
Something just, Dr. Russell, I think people should take advantage of is, the Odo Forum is in its second year, and it's going to be the 25th and 26th of April in Alexandria, hosted by the whole private practice side of the academy. And these conversations are in every room. And it's something that I think benefits people in academics, hospital employment, private practice. They're just really, really hot topics, and including young people in those conversations is important because we're not doing it for us. We're doing it for the next gen, which is part of the responsibility. So if people have the opportunity, I think that's a great, great meeting to go to. And anybody that goes, by the way, that is in their residency or fellowship, Dr. Mellon will buy the beer.
So
Well, there's a travel grant if you want to go to it.
is that what they're calling it at the bar? Travel grant?
Yeah.
So I would also say Dr. Woodard is really
Uh,
interested in pulling
I'll
together
buy
all the
beer. That's
mentoring.
extra, but yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to say Dr. Woodard is also really interested in pulling together all the mentoring pieces that are happening in all the societies and at the academy and all the sections. And so I would lean into those, whether they're those organic relationships like Doug talked about, of the people you trained with and that you train and that you meet, or if you're like, I want to be Dr. Mellon when I grow up. And so you reach out to him and have a conversation, because those are really, really valuable. And those have absolutely served me as I've worked through my career.
All right, y'all. Thank you so much for your time. I truly can't thank you enough. This was really, really helpful, and I'm sure our trainees are really going to enjoy it. And thank you for the plug for the Odo Forum. We'll make sure that we're posting about that on our social media as well. And so hopefully we can get the word out to the trainees, and we'll have a lot of young representation. Thank you again, and we'll be sharing this in just a little bit. And I hope you all have a great rest of your evening.
Thanks,
Yeah, you
everybody.
too. Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.
Enjoy-
Yeah, thank you.
Take care,
Enjoy the
everyone.
snow, everybody.